For us to shine, we have to be able to see the goodness in others. Because it had changed into caring about him, my reality had actually changed. We often go into battle, we think, right, this person is causing my pain, I've got to sort it out. But looking back on it, I just feel that I was really blind.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Modern Buddhism podcast, and today I'm in conversation with Gen Doryning. He's been studying, practicing and teaching meditation and Buddhism for many years now, living as a Buddhist monk since 2004. And in this incredible conversation, we really chat through how we can all learn to deal with conflict in a much healthier way.
If I'm having a difficult person in front of me, this is my opportunity to unravel something within me. There is a way of being in this conflict situation, but bringing out the best in people. It's made me someone who I like to be.
Gen Doryning, thanks for dropping into the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
When we're in a conflict situation with another person, we tend to have this tendency to go out to resolve the situation with the person, but the healthiest way actually to deal with that conflict, as you and I know, is really to begin to turn inwards, because the real problem actually, and it seems quite radical to people at the beginning, is not what's happening out there with the other person. It's really how we're responding in here. So maybe we could explore that a little bit at the beginning and your experience of that and how to work with that so that we can give people some takeaways in that situation.
Yeah, it's a great point. Whenever we're in a conflict situation, we just don't feel very good, do we? And there's pain arising in our mind, and I guess the problem is that it feels as though the pain is coming from the person that we're in conflict with, or the situation that we're in conflict with. And so I think most of us feel that the only way to get away from that pain is to change or push away the person or the situation. In fact, Adam, I would say personally, it was conflict that was a real game changer for me. Like, I think I became a seeker. I think we could call it that. I became a spiritual seeker because of conflict, because of this very point that you're making. Many years ago, I was working in a corporate. Is it okay just to go straight into a little story?
Absolutely. We love a story on this podcast.
So I was working in a corporate environment in a merchant bank, and I was the youngest person in the team, and I always felt like as a result of that I was treated differently to the rest of the team, and my boss would always give me the work that others weren't doing. I was always treated quite badly, or so I felt at the time. And it was around that time that I decided to learn to meditate, because it was a fairly high stress environment. I wasn't a banker as such. I was working in telecommunications, but within the banking industry. And I was getting to the point where I felt that this person was impossible. And I'm trying to basically have a happy life whilst going to work in these oppressive conditions, So eventually I decided I needed to learn to meditate to be able to feel more comfortable at work. After I got, and it was a centre in Sydney, Kadam Meditation Centre Sydney, that I went to. And after a while, once I got to know the teachers and the community, I asked them this question. I said, look, I've got this incredibly difficult boss, and can you give me some advice on how I can deal with this person? And the teacher, even now it makes me smile, but the teacher said, you're going to need to love him. And I remember my everything dropped. I thought, I was expecting him to say, well, be more patient, you'll have to accept. The last thing I was expecting was, you need to love the person who's making your life difficult. So I think at the time I even argued with him. I even said, no, do you mean I need to be more accepting? He said, no, you need to love him. And I said, but do you have any idea how difficult he is? And the teacher said to me, it's entirely up to you what you do, but if you want to solve this problem, you've got to love him. I thought, oh no. So the next day when I went to work, I okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to love him. I was prepared to take this on as a project. So I looked at him and completely failed. Yeah, I thought, nah, this is impossible. The next day, I tried again. So every day I tried again, even though for quite a few days I got nowhere. And I started to use I started to get creative. One thing I did was I remember this clearly one day, was I superimposed mentally, not literally, I mentally superimposed my brother's face onto my boss. And one thing I learned was that my brother could get away with a lot more than my boss could get away with. And so every day I kept trying, these little creative ideas. And, they say Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So it took a while. But after, I don't know, 6 weeks, again, I'll never forget it, my boss started to tell me jokes. I'm not saying they were funny, but in these corporate settings, you sit in a cubicle, with your desk, with the partitions around you. Anyway, he'd come rolling over on his chair to my cubicle, tell me a joke, and then roll off again. And I thought, oh my goodness me, he's completely different. And, another week on, he started to tell me about some difficulties he was having with his wife, with his kids, like some real troubles he was having at home. Now, we were never going to be best friends, but we definitely had a nice relationship. So after a while, I went back. I was going to the center regularly anyway, and I went back to the center and I spoke to the teacher and I said, you know what? I did what you said. Like, I loved him. I did what you said. And I have to say, you were right. He changed. And then the teacher looked at me in the eyes and said, no, he didn't. And even today, I get, I get goosebumps, right? Because it suddenly dawned on me that in reality, I was the problem. And that because my mind had changed from, I don't know, maybe being a bit tense or self-focused, because it had changed into caring about him, my reality had actually changed. And it was from that experience that I thought, you know what, I need to see how far the rabbit hole goes. I need to, if I can change my reality so drastically within a couple of months, how much can reality change through changing the mind? And so then it was at that point that I then became more serious about the Buddhist path. And it was eventually that experience that led to me ordaining as a monk. So I know we've kicked off already straight into a story, but it was conflict that really led me into the path of spiritual development.
But the great thing about that story is it highlights everything we're exploring today perfectly before we start exploring it. It's that story is showing the real challenge we face and also the solution at the same time. Because our normal, as we both know, our normal reaction is, oh no, the problem's the boss. It's absolutely nothing to do with me. I mean, I may be responding to the difficult boss, but the difficult boss is the real problem. And what you're highlighting there, just very experientially for you, it was just like, let's try this. I'm just going to experiment with this. Is that understanding of like, we have within our tradition and within the Buddhist understanding, this idea of a separation between an outer problem, in this case, the difficult boss, and the inner problem, our response to, our resistance to, our rejection of, our frustration or anger with that boss. And that's the real problem. It's this inner problem. But in your story, it highlights it immediately. I'm struggling with this. I think there's no solution to this. But as you start to take that advice on board and just try your best even to begin to see that person with a degree of acceptance that opened up a space for a little bit better way of seeing them and maybe developing some warmth or affection or, I don't know, love gradually over that period of time, the problem just goes away. because we think it's them. And that's the challenge. Every time we think it's out beyond us or beyond our mind, we disempower ourselves. We put ourselves in this space where we have no choice but to engage in conflict to resolve this thing, because unless we engage in conflict, get them to change their mind, nothing's going to change. Whereas your story perfectly illustrates the opening point here, which is you change your mind, you change your reality. You're not necessarily changing their reality. Although what I love about that story is you obviously, to some degree, influenced that person because they thought, actually, this person is more at peace with who I am. Because often when people feel judged, they tighten up, they tense up, and actually in that situation, maybe they become more the boss. Whereas in that situation for you, it's like my acceptance of them to a degree, my love for them, as I'm improving that, they start to lighten up. Their good qualities come out a little bit more, at least their jokes come out a little bit more, even if they're not brilliant. But in that sense, we start to create this space between us and others. Actually, the more I accept them, the more I love them, the more this conflict can change, and maybe actually we get on a good footing.
Do you know what happened in the end of that story? I mean, I know I'm still carrying on with it, right? But as soon as we became friends, and it is related to what you're saying, but as soon as we became friends, I got a phone call from my manager to say that role is completely finished and you're now going into a different role. And it felt like it was a lesson. It was some spiritual lesson that I needed to learn, or I wasn't going to be able to move on in my life. And it really felt like that, this going with this notion that it seemed like there was something there that needed to be dealt with, as opposed to my mind being changed. I was stuck in that situation for such a long time. And when it was resolved, and it wasn't resolved through him changing at all, other than the way his appearance changed as I changed, the whole thing disappeared. The office, the environment, it all disappeared, and I was in a completely different role. But I honestly look back on it and I think he was probably a nice person. I think it was more, maybe you're right, maybe as I cared for him and to a degree, of course, accepted him, maybe I did draw out a different side of him. But looking back on it, I just feel that I was really blind to what was there, because my own mind didn't allow me to see that this was a good person. I was just unable to see it, because in the same way that I was able to superimpose my brother's face on his, which was difficult because my brother's from Crawley and he was from Hong Kong. But there was a way that I was able to do it. In the same way that I did that, I was obviously in my mind creating a version of him based on my own unpleasant feelings, turning that into an image that I then superimposed on him. And so, yeah, I mean, exactly what you're saying. It was that image that I was creating based on my own feelings and then superimposing that was the real problem. That's what we say, isn't it? Like with the inner problems, outer problems. I was creating a problem. Yeah.
And then as a result of that, we suffer. I mean, that's the thing, is like our minds create this experience for us that none of us want to be in. Like none of us want to be in that place where we're seeing faults in others, feeling stuck in that, feeling there's no potential in them, no capacity to be any different. But when you're in it, it feels this is absolutely not going to change. They just are the way they are. But like for you, what's also very empowering about that opened up a whole new world for you and a whole new way of life for you that became very transformative. Because I often think, like sometimes you speak to friends or family, and I say friends and family, really we're talking about ourselves and our friends and our family. But, like when you move from one situation to another, so you might move from one town to another, you might move from one job to another, you think, finally I've got away from all those difficult people in that village, or finally I've got away from all those difficult people at that work. And then you go into that new job and they might look different, these new people around you, but they feel quite similar. The situation is quite similar, because what's happening is our karma, so to speak, from a Buddhist point of view, is just constantly ripening as these situations that are appearing to our mind, meaning The way we live our life determines what's appearing to us and how things appear. It's only when we change our mind we can change those situations. So we go to the next job, and for a few weeks we think, oh, finally I've got rid of them. And then all of a sudden they appear again, just with a different face, a different background, but it's the same problem. But I guess what your story is revealing really powerfully is actually when you change your mind, you start to change the situation. Not only there though, because as you move to the next job, as you did in this context, you move into another role, you're now more prepared. You have more capacity and ability to relate to that situation very differently, because when that trigger happens, you think, yeah, they're not the problem. It's coming from my mind again. And it's important to understand we're not the problem either. It's coming from your mind and our out of control mind at times. So I just think that's really empowering with that story, is when you shift from one job to another, not only have you resolved the problem there, but you're actually beginning to resolve these inner problems more and more over time.
I would say, though, as much as I'd like to say that I became the embodiment of love and acceptance, I feel that there was would you call it beginner's luck, or would you call it, like, I think there's something happens when you begin the spiritual path, right? A Buddhist would say probably you receiving a lot of blessings from enlightened beings. Like, somehow I was able to do that. That was my project at the time. But we're talking over 20 years ago, and it's still been a journey since then. Like, one thing we just talked about was how we touched on inner and outer problems, and that's one of the things that we learn. And again, in that story, as I solved my inner problem, I solved my outer problem. And yes, that did make me better prepared when I went on to the next thing. But I can tell you, I've still made a lot of mistakes. Because it was only later in my spiritual life that I really got to understand just how profound controlling one's own feelings is with respect to solving problems. Whereas in that situation with my boss, my teacher said love him, and I stubbornly loved him. But it probably took quite a long time for me to really connect that by loving him, I was changing the way I feel about my reality, and therefore changing my reality.
Have you ever had one of those situations where you're having a bad day? I know you don't have those, but theoretically,
sorry,
theoretically,
yeah.
If you and I have a bad day, which of course we all do, I certainly do. If you have a bad day and you're introduced to somebody brand new, it's like you kind of know that per person is being introduced to the very worst of you on that day. But then, because of the way we tend to grasp at what's appearing to us to be like fixed in some way, that person may well just fix this idea in their mind. That's just who you are. And you know, that's not who I am. You kind of want to say to them, listen, I just want to tell you, I'm having a rubbish day. And I'm not normally like this, really, I'm not. But often we do that with people when we're in conflict situations. We get into conflict with people and grasp at this idea as that's who they are. And it really creates so much havoc in that relationship with them going forward. But if we could just say, listen, I'm sorry, I'm just having a rubbish day. I'm not normally like this. It's like it almost opens up a door for healing in that relationship straight away. But some people, they can be just in one conflict with one person on one day, and that's it. Their relationship with that person becomes uncomfortable for the rest of the time they know that person. And if that person, from that point on, is appearing regularly in your life, there's only one person guaranteed to be suffering as a result of that misstep, is you. Because every time you see them, you're going to be like, oh, they think I'm a terrible person, and I am a terrible person. And so we get caught up in this kind of conflict situation within ourselves and with them over time, because there's always a tension between us if we're not able to resolve it. So what you're seeing in that situation with that nun is like, I was able to shift out of that view just through the power of somebody else's view of them. But then obviously it opened the door for that relationship to heal very quickly, I would guess, in that situation, and also to become friends over time. Because I think that's the challenge. Often we're seeing things from this perspective, and then we're getting lost in it, and then thinking there's no hope for this relationship, and we give up on people just as a result of one bad day.
And on both sides of the situation, the person who you're perceiving as difficult or bad, and the person we are, it seems like the amount of mud that builds up happens at the same time. Like, if we respond by concluding this is a bad person, that too is mud kind of gathering up around our Buddha nature, and doesn't help the other person to be any different. I think it's interesting, like, for us to shine, we have to be able to see the goodness in others. And if we go back to the original story about loving my boss, if we are really to shine, and if we're really to solve all this inner problem and dissolve away the mud around our own pure nature and be at peace in conflict, eventually we've got to love people too. And I suppose what I'm sort of thinking is, they're not easy to love, are they? That's the problem. Like, that was an extreme story, but people are always going to be behaving in ways that are going to make them appear impossible to love. And so we almost have to know that people are going to behave this because of the, what you're describing as the mud, the delusions, the negativity, the bad day. But we, if you like, the responsibility on us, if we're the ones who want to develop and grow and be strong in conflict, the onus is a little bit on us to develop the ability to see beyond that and to be able to say, well, I think maybe they are a good person. Like, in all of those examples, eventually, as my mind changed, it was only as my mind changed that I was able to see more of them. So there's like the goodness that they show and the goodness that I can see seems to be related, doesn't it? As it always seems with Buddhism.
And I guess isn't that what's so empowering about it, though? Because, like you say, it's not easy to consciously choose to love people in our normal everyday lives. It's not easy, it's not easy to accept people. But when you have that growing experience in your heart of the truth of your potential, and also the honesty with that you struggle to live up to that most days, certainly in my case, it's getting to a place of peace with that. Because there isn't some kind of perfect version of this. It's like, on the training in this kind of inner development, this spiritual development in your heart, you've really got to get to a place to be at peace with the fact that through confidence in your own experience, not theory alone, you have that pure potential. You're living from a degree of, or an increasing degree of, and stability of a peaceful mind and a good heart of love, compassion, and wisdom. So you know that to be true of yourself, but you're also very honest. You struggle to live up to that most of the time, because that is just the reality of anyone. We have these delusions we were talking about earlier on that we can gradually let go of. They're by no means a fixed part of who we are. They are the mud on the gold nugget, but they're there. And any other version of that is you're kidding yourself to think, well, I'm fine, I've got this amazing potential. But then that's just going to backfire on you when you completely lose it with somebody and you think you're this truly, certainly in my own experience, now I'm finally getting it and I'm a spiritual practitioner, I'm always going to be loving, and then you lose it with somebody, you think, oh no, I'm terrible. So when we start to shift that within us, it gets easier. Not always easy, as you say, it's not always easy, even if you're training in this, to love people, to accept them. But one thing that I think I remember having this conversation with a family member years ago where they were talking about how they're very, very much struggling with another family member and how the person is toxic, and I just can't seem to connect with them anymore, and I'm really struggling with this relationship with them. And, no matter what I do for them, they're never grateful, and it's really difficult for me. And just on that day, it touched me, and I just thought, but, at the end of the day, I understand what you're saying. And of course, that is the situation you're in. But that's either a problem for you or a suffering for them. At the end of the day, it's your choice. It can either be a problem for you for the rest of your life, or you can begin to open your heart to understanding really what you're seeing is a suffering for them. Their mind's out of control. They're not able to work with their mind. The expectation or attachment to expectation that people should be other than what they are in that moment is entirely unrealistic. And I guess for me, sometimes when I think of conflict, it's that idea. When you learn to combine acceptance of the way people are in any given moment and also understanding their potential to be better than this over time, with that compassion that can really engage fully with their reality without any hesitation, That's the most powerful way to really overcome conflict, to be able to forgive others too.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with what you're saying. And if we as were to combine that as well with a wish to grow, because that's the other thing is like, do we want to be stuck as a victim of the situation? Or do we want to be able to use this to become a person who is able to stay peaceful even in difficult situations? Because if we're in a difficult situation, I mean, this is the beauty of what we've learned over the years, isn't it? Like we have the ability to say, okay, yes, there's this difficult person, this toxic person, abusive person. Yes, that person's there. We're not denying that. But we're also able to say, but this is how I feel about it. As you were pointing out to this person, you know, I'm focused on my problem. And I think it was, I think it's in the Universal Geshe Chekawa, who he describes adverse conditions. You know, when he says an adversity is a mere imputation by a conceptual mind that's labeling it adverse. So whether this is, I mean, I know that some of the listeners are probably in extreme situations, but I'm just going back over the various difficulties I've had in my life. If I've decided, for me personally, if I've decided I want to be at peace, that's my decision, I want to be at peace in this situation, then I can use the situation as a mirror to look at what's happening in my mind. I mean, I'm being careful because I don't want to say that some situations they need help. You know, maybe if you're in a violent situation or a difficult situation, don't do anything silly. But if you're just in a conflict situation with a boss or a colleague or a family member, like a toxic situation, there is a lot of opportunity to learn about ourselves in that situation. I'm not saying don't do anything practically to resolve it, but I don't know, like all through my life, and I'm sure it's been the same for you, difficulties have come, and there's always, you mentioned these two options of either see them as suffering or see yourself stuck in a problem which could last forever. But personally, my greatest feelings of happiness, not that I'm having that many, but the times I felt happiest, and in terms of happiness, I'm not talking about excitement or the pleasure of an ice cream or a holiday. Like the genuine feelings of peace that I've had have come out of adversity. They've come out of difficulty. And so those peaceful feelings, they've arisen from what felt like great suffering or great situations of conflict, beginning with my boss, you know. And so as time's gone on, the more I've understood about this inner and outer problems, resolving my unpleasant feeling problem, and understanding actually that my unpleasant feeling is also helping me to see this as bad, because nobody experiences an unpleasant feeling and says this is great, in the same way that nobody experiences a pleasant feeling and say this is terrible. But knowing that perhaps I can control my feelings, even though I can't control this toxic person, it's giving me confidence to think, well, maybe I can change my reality a little bit. And so as a result of knowing this, and I just feel fortunate to have received this information, because as a result of knowing this, it's the difficulties that have led to peace. Because you can think, right, okay, well, I can accept this painful feeling, or I can understand that my real problem is the fact I'm not at peace and that I have this bad feeling, and I can then use that to springboard into some kind of other practice. And I think sometimes we create the conflict because we expect a difficulty to come, and then we develop a bad feeling, and then we see a toxic person, or we see a difficult boss, or we see something that's unpleasant. And I remember talking to a corporate manager, who had to discipline a member of staff because the member of staff was doing something wrong, and they had to take them into an office and basically say to them, look, you're breaking the rules. This is your first warning. And they said to me that they were so afraid of having to go into that situation that they started to dislike the person. And I thought it was so interesting. I mean, I've done this all through my life, friend. But it was so interesting to hear this, because their job is to solve a problem. Like, this person's job is to go in and say, look, you're doing this, you need to stop doing it. Have a great day. But because they were beginning to develop fear of having to go into this quote unquote conflict situation, they were developing bad feelings, externalizing these bad feelings, and then deciding this person was the cause of these bad feelings, and then developing dislike and aversion towards them. Now, if you then have to go in and have strong words with them, you have to wade through a soup of unpleasant emotions just to get the words out. And you have to say, that's nothing to do with the person that you're disciplining. Like, we created that with our own mind.
And actually, if you really acknowledge that, which isn't always easy to do, but if you acknowledge that in your heart, that actually at that moment, before I engage with this situation, I'm setting myself up to fail here. And I'm also creating the basis for a difficult conversation with this person, as opposed to just relax, be in that moment with that person and see what comes out. You have a job to do. Obviously, you need to resolve this situation, but don't put yourself in a situation where you're setting yourself up to fail and you're setting this particular situation up for conflict. And I remember getting this advice as I was listening to you some years ago from a very wise teacher who said to me, I said, how is it that you just can keep listening to people coming back with the same old problem over and over and over again, and actually you keep giving the same old advice? How can you do that and be really at peace with that? And she said to me, because every time that person walks into the room, I know in my heart it's a brand new person. So this is like that teaching within the Buddhist understanding of subtle impermanence. Everything is changing moment to moment, and if we check, it's brand new in every moment. For example, you and I sitting here are very different to the you and I that were sitting here when we came into the room. We're in flow now, we're having a chat, we're having a conversation. We're just sharing insights and experience, and it's very different to when we woke up this morning and we knew we had to come into the studio to do a podcast. And yet we hold this sense. There's still this permanent sense of me here, but if you actually look a little bit more deeply, there never could be. We're constantly changing. The thoughts and feelings, emotions I have at the moment, even how my body feels at the moment, is entirely different than when I came into this room. And the sense of me that's sitting here has completely changed if we look at our own direct experience. And so it is for everyone else. We go back to that story I was saying, when somebody locks in on you having a bad day and you're a bit grumpy, and they lock in on that's who that person is. It's like, that's what you've got to live with now until you eventually resolve that. And some people never resolve that, as opposed to that teacher who said, when they come into that room, it's a brand new person, because in reality, it actually is. I remember Geshe Kelsang saying this once. He said, blink and it's a whole new world.
Wow.
And that's the truth. Now, of course, we have to understand that more deeply over time, but we know if we just look at our own direct experience. So when you walk into that situation and you have something to deal with, and obviously you have to explain the guidelines, you have to explain to people this is inappropriate behavior. Don't bring your historical sense of who that person is and the potential for who they can be, which is usually quite limited if we're in that graspy, stuck mode. But actually, I'm just stepping into a brand new situation. I'm a brand new person. They're a brand new person, and there's potential in this situation for it to change. It may not, I don't know. But if I step in that place with that space in my mind, now I'm just willing to listen where they're at. I can hear them anew every time. I can hear them afresh in the struggles they have with their mind. And I can open up within my heart a sense of connection and compassion to that person's reality that would have been impossible if I walk in with this very fixed sense of who they are and what they can be. So when we're in conflict, often it is that we're grasping at, they're this way, they're that way, they're never going to change. That person you're grasping at doesn't exist. They may have momentarily appeared that way for you last week, but they're changing every single moment and every single day. And if we combine that with understanding this incredible potential people have, it just begins to open up a door, at least, for more compassion, more acceptance.
Yeah, you and I talked another time actually about being a condition for bringing out the best in someone. We talked about it on another occasion. And I think the same thing applies. Like, if we are grasping at that person being not just fixed, but because we've developed an unpleasant feeling towards them because we're afraid of going into that situation, we're not just seeing them as fixed, we're seeing them as a fixed source of my pain. And then to be able to then go and discipline that person when you've already got a negative mind towards them, it's not going to go well. But I think if we were following what you've just explained about subtle impermanence, about how everything's changing, and we combine that with the knowledge that actually my problem is my bad feelings, which I can dissolve away through accepting and wanting to grow and wanting to have a more love and more compassion, then I wonder, we could go into that situation with a wish to help them. You could imagine the difference. Like, if you were the person on the receiving end, if I was being taken into a room to be spoken to, and then my boss was a practitioner who had come to peace through dissolving their feelings, realizing, or at least being open to subtle impermanence, everything's changed, wanting to be a better person, wanting to grow, and they said, right, come on, what's going on for you? Maybe you'd just open your heart to them. And then maybe we would both realize that it's because there's a bit of mud on the gold nugget. I'm having a bad time at home. My life isn't going the way that I thought. It's bringing out the worst in me. Thank you for asking. So there's a way of dealing with difficulties between people that can be productive for both people, can't they? Like, the boss could say, look, I need to tell you that something's going wrong. You're not going to be able to keep this up. Are you okay? Do you want to talk to me? And so you can see that there is a way of being in this conflict situation, but bringing out the best in people. If I'm having a difficult person in front of me, this is my opportunity to unravel something within me. Like, why do I feel this way? Because for as long as I feel this way, I'm not going to really be able to help this person. Just on the back of the story with the boss, like, if I can just be at peace in this difficulty, then I've got a whole new method, a whole new set of tools for dealing with this person. But a set of tools that's not only going to make me happy, but perhaps it's going to help this person. And I think we miss this so many times in life. I know we're going sort of full circle, but we just go into war. We often go into battle. We think, right, this person is causing my pain. I've got to sort it out. I've got to roll up my sleeves. I've got to get in there and I've got to fix it. But what does it really mean? I don't know. What does it really mean to fix it? Maybe it means to fix us,
Do you just trigger me on that to remember a situation that I would say was one of the most pivotal points in my own life and really my own, to agree to spiritual development. It was a situation I was in, and it was a colleague at work, and things really weren't going well. They weren't managing their area very well, and the situation wasn't going very well, and it was causing me a load of problems. At least I thought it was at the time. And I knew I'd have to have this very honest conversation with them and just kind of be very kind of, that phrase we use, brutally honest. I don't know why we use the word brutally and honest, because if we really think about it, brutally, who wants to live from that place? But anyway, I thought I needed to be brutally honest. And so I set up, let's go for a coffee, because then it kind of would feel a little bit more informal. But really in my mind, I had this idea, I'm going to tell them the way it is, and I'm going to get this thing sorted because I haven't got time for this. I'm very busy. All that arrogance. And and then I came to this coffee shop, and I walked in, and he's having a coffee and looking exhausted and actually really overwhelmed, it seemed to me. And so I had this whole list. I prepared a list, a bulleted, pointed list of all the things I'm going to tell him he's doing wrong. And then I just sat down, and it was just on that moment I just really connected, and it just felt like I could feel his pain. As we sometimes say in Buddhism, just for that moment at least, as keenly as I felt my own. And there was something just shifted and everything dissolved. I'm not saying it was a profound moment of realization. It was just a moment when everything from my side dissolved. And I just said to him, how are you? And then it just opened up this whole other space where he was able to express how he was feeling, how he was struggling with work, how he was struggling with all of this. And I know for me that day, I thought, now I'm really kind of connecting with this individual as he is, not as I perceive him or as how I'm grasping at him, but as he is as a human being. I'm connecting with our shared humanity. I'm struggling with this person, but actually he's struggling an awful lot more with his mind. And on that day, it really opened up this whole other experience for me. I thought I was giving him at that day my space and time to really listen to him, to connect with him. But in reality, that person gave me the greatest gift I've ever received ever since, which is an understanding of what life could be if we just didn't obsess about ourselves and moved our hearts to others. Again, like everything, it was just a moment, and that moment opened up a door that enabled me to begin to work with these things. And I'm still working with it and still messing it up on a regular basis. I just call that Monday. But that person just opened up a whole new way of seeing things for me. And it's like you're explaining there, when we really start to connect with another person's reality, we actually do see everyone struggling. We just don't see it. Do you know what I mean? Because we're caught up in our own struggles. But when we do see it, you can't help but compassion arise in your mind. And actually in that moment, the greatest gift is given from their side, not from your side. They show you what real peace feels like, what real joy feels like, which is a mind of pure compassion.
It's so obvious when you talk about it in hindsight, isn't it? It's so clear. Like, this is what Buddha came to this world to do, isn't it? It's really showing us that these perhaps we could say, not in every case, but in many cases, these conflict situations, they're almost like illusions. And once we change, the conflict really disappears. Like in your story, as soon as you saw his pain, there was no conflict. This was someone that needed some support and some love and some help, which in turn made you feel on top of the world. Now, that's real success, isn't it? That's you found the meaning of life. And so, again, if Buddha's saying an adverse condition is just a label or an imputation, then how can you say whether something is good or bad in the end? A friend of mine, he's a sales manager, and he's very young, and everyone in his team are a lot older than him. And one of the team members developed cancer, and this particular team member didn't like this guy, the boss, my friend, and always made his life difficult and always tried to trip him up and undermine him. When he developed cancer, he had to take over his accounts, his sales accounts, and he was off work for 9 months, 10 months, something like this. And this guy that I know had to do all of his work for 8 or 9 months. And then at the end of the work, at the end of the 9 months, he gave every penny of the commission to him, knowing that he had made his life difficult for 9 months. Sometimes you meet people who are natural Buddhists, don't you? Like, who we spend our life training, and then you meet these people who have never been to a class in their life. He spends 9 months doing his work, and then gave every penny of the commission to him. And he told me that when he went round to his house to tell him I've arranged for the money to be paid into your salary, he broke down in tears and then became his most loyal supporter because of kindness. And I think, it's just illustrating your own story, that in the end, if we change for the better, the so-called conflicts seem to, they change their nature. They change into possible opportunities rather than inherent difficulties, don't they?
Often people think there's some power in conflict. If I can assert my view or assert my anger on this situation in some way, I have the power position. But real power is the flexibility to accept and love people. Because if people feel accepted and loved, if they really genuinely feel it, you're not just pretending, but you genuinely in your heart accept people as they are and love them deeply, that creates this deep connection where it's that ability then to connect with people that enables us to get things done, instead of kind of imposing your anger upon them or your title upon them or whatever you're doing as a boss. Real power in any position is our ability to cherish and love others, because then we all want to work together. We're creating the conditions and the environment where actually we're all beginning to realize, the more I cherish you, the more I love you, the more I put you first in my mind, actually the more we deepen our connection, and then we're willing to work together in a healthy way. So in that sense, we full circle on this conversation. At the beginning, conflict seems the only solution, and as you're explaining beautifully there, it really isn't. It's your ability to accept, love people, cherish them, feel their happiness is really important. That guy's going through a terrible time with the cancer, and just to feel somebody genuinely cared enough to do all his work and to give all that commission creates a connection that I would say could potentially last, the rest of your life, or from a Buddhist point of view, lifetimes. And we can change things just by the choices we make in our heart. As difficult as it may appear sometimes, we can change these situations that are potentially conflict situations into really transformative situations.
Absolutely. I like the word, the use of the word power, like real power. I mean, most people think you have to conquer. Like, power means conquer your opponent. But it doesn't, just from the conversation we've had, potentially doesn't really achieve anything. It puts you in a weaker position. You lose friends, you lose support. Whereas if you can instead use the difficulty to improve as a person and to connect with the people around you, especially, and genuinely, especially to the point where you're really caring for your would-be opponent, you're succeeding, you're winning. Like, I don't know how we would define success in the context of this discussion, because there are people there'll be kind of corporate people listening, and career people and athletes and endurance people listening to this discussion. But if we really want to sort of quantify success from one point of view, it's when you reach the end of your life, do you feel that you've led a good life? I mean, that's really going to be the equalizer for all of us, isn't it? Like, when we reach our deathbed and then we start looking back over our life thinking, did I live a good life? I think it's in these times, like the story with the boss who dealt with his staff member with cancer, the story with you and your colleague who you had to have those strong words to that you didn't have to in the end. When you look back, as you said, it was life-changing. If you look back at your life and you think, I'm so happy with the person I am because of how I dealt with those difficulties. And of course, it's much easier said than done. But when the difficulty is coming, there's such a panic to just escape or to dissolve it. But actually, we could be looking back on this in a few years' time thinking, it's made me a beautiful person. It's made me someone who I like to be. And so almost we shouldn't miss these opportunities, should we? Like, this is just coming out of this conversation. Like, I'm thinking, if I walk out of here and bump into a difficult person, it's so fresh in my mind that I'm going to think this is an opportunity. We don't want to reach the end of our life looking back thinking, I conquered, I beat this person, I overpowered this person, they couldn't mess with me. I don't know, maybe if you're in a boxing ring, you need to think a bit like that. But in terms of the meaning of your life, you want to look back and think, I stayed at peace and made other people happy, should we say despite, or should we say because of the difficulty? That's amazing, isn't it? That's another level.
I was hearing you saying that easier said than done. We often say that. The kind of conclusion of easier said than done is, if you're anything like me, you just don't do it.
Don't do it.
But actually, if we just engage with everything we're looking at today from the beginning of this conversation, just slowly, gradually build this new way of seeing things, the new way of experiencing things, new way of interacting with others, one day at a time. Because today may be the only day you have. We assume we have forever, but actually today may be the last day of your life, because that's just the reality of things. Instead of thinking it's easier said than done, just give yourself the time and space to give it a go doing it today. Because as you say, ultimately, if we have a long and healthy life, that's fantastic. We get to the end of our life and we leave this life the way we've lived this life. If you've really lived from a peaceful mind and a good heart today, trying to avoid the conflict and the difficulties we have normally with people. And just today, you try your best at that. And even if it's not perfect today, that will feel like a truly successful day at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, it isn't what you got done at the end of this day. I mean, that makes you feel like that was a successful day. It's how you feel inside. Like you're really at peace with how you live today, or to some degree more at peace with the way you lived yesterday. And if you can live every day like that and wake up the next day with that sense of peace and positive energy and energy to continue doing that tomorrow, well, great. But every day will feel to you, even if it was a challenging day, even if you had a difficult boss or a difficult situation or a difficult conversation, the degree to which you can transform that will give you the peace of mind, the happiness, the joy, the increasing good qualities of the heart, love, compassion, and wisdom. So when you put your head down at the end of the day, you think, that was a challenging one, but it was a good one. And then, as you say very beautifully, then at the end of your life, you look back in your life, you said, I've lived a good life. I'm really at peace with things. That was a successful life for me. No matter what I accomplish externally, it feels like a success.
Yeah. I think maybe we can say then, one foot in front of the other every single day. And if we can do this one day at a time, if we do this, I think we will come to just deeply like who we are. And like we could even get to a point that even if other people didn't like us, even if nobody liked us, we could reach a point where we're so happy with our own integrity and our own peace and our own goodness that we don't need people to like us. I mean, it's almost like the secret of self-esteem and self-confidence is that we're happy with who we are. I mean, that's important because so often, and a huge part of the conflict situation is that we're just so fearful of what others think of us, and that's why we want to win. But if we are okay with who we are because of our integrity and because we're using these situations to become peaceful and develop good qualities, then as you say, when we reach the end of the day, both today and at the end of our life, we'll be at peace. Yeah, I like what you said about saying it was a challenging one, but it was a good one. Perfect.
Great. I couldn't think of a better place to end this conversation. I mean, I personally would love to continue with this conversation because there's so much more we could talk about. But Gen Doryning, I've really enjoyed today, I really have. And I think anyone listening today, there's just so much in there for all of us to begin to draw from and to begin to move in this direction a bit more. So thanks so much for dropping in.
Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it.